This meeting on research and evaluation is the first in our series of forum events under the Together for Change programme. For those of you who are new to us, the Together for Change programme was set up by Solver Care in partnership with PlanEd and Pembrokeshire Association of Voluntary Services, PAVS in short. The purpose of the programme is for the sectors to work closely together to support and sustain community groups through 3 work streams: developing joint plans based on social and green models of health and well-being, building and using the evidence base, and supporting communities by sharing, learning and mentoring. We have a really exciting agenda, rather crowded today. In the first half, we will discuss in small chaired breakout groups some of the current issues facing research and evaluation. In the second half, after a short break, you will hear 4 short presentations on research and evaluation reports. But let me turn to setting the scene. Our focus today will be communities of place, of geography, and will centre on a type of community development often called asset-based community development, or ABCD for short. ABCD refers to an approach in which communities themselves are in control, deciding their priorities, how to meet those priorities using their strengths. The strengths can be local people, the connections between them, their buildings or land, and the access they have to services, and the nature of their relationships with external agencies. The specific purpose of asset-based community development can be varied depending on the assets that a community has and the assets that they can build on. For example, it can be creating a community land trust and building affordable housing for the community, or creating a social support initiative run by volunteers. However, even though there are big differences, the overall aim is usually to do with well-being, the well-being of individuals and the community or the neighbourhood as a whole, making the locality a good place to live. It falls into the category that services call prevention and early intervention, stopping people from becoming ill or delaying the onset of illness. Those of us steeped in community development, and that probably means everybody here today, have always recognised the value of it, and now there is research evidence to prove it. The local authority network, New Local, has found that substantial benefits can accrue for communities and the public sector if communities are involved in the policy decisions that affect them, or even better, if that is extended to collaborative approaches. Communities can also benefit if they are supported to build capacity and are able to own community assets. These approaches can improve individual health and well-being and community resilience and cohesion. They can enhance democratic participation and boost trust. On the service side, they can embed prevention and early intervention and lead to cost savings. I want to turn now to what I see as the current context of research and evaluation, which is understandably dominating everything. I'm referring, of course, to the pandemic. We know from experience and the many research studies just how devastating the pandemic has been and the massive challenges that face the nation in rebuilding and recovering from it. Jessie Buchanan and Amy Gill in Together for Change have reviewed many of these studies, and the review is available on our website. People have lost friends and loved ones. They've lost their jobs and livelihoods. Children's education has been affected. people are uncertain about the future, and all of this has impacted negatively on mental health. Also, years of austerity and cutbacks to services have compounded the shocking inequalities which are endemic in our society. On the other hand, community spirit has never been stronger. We are working more closely together, working in new ways, often freed up from bureaucratic processes. Communities and public sector and third sector organisations are increasingly taking a holistic approach to well-being. In Pembrokeshire, for example, we have agreed a forward-thinking and exciting 10-point plan for supporting communities. So evaluation has never been more important, and we need better funding for it. Whether we are talking about building evaluation into local innovations and other projects, or looking across communities to get a better understanding of what works where and why. I would argue that this needs an understanding of the complexity of community development, operating as it does most successfully on a small scale, flexibly, with bespoke solutions, and at its own pace, especially if co-designed with external services and agencies. This means that it is inappropriate to rely, or at least solely rely, on counting and looking at scale and efficiencies that are so important to the market-driven processes of the public sector. Communities have taken centre stage, and it's good to see that building communities' trust are lobbying the Welsh Government hard to make sure that they stay there. I want to go back to the wordplay in the title of our meeting, does it count? Well, I'd like to answer that now. Yes, communities do, because they are crucial for health and well-being. Should they be counted? Yes, their groups and organisations should be to track their numbers and volunteers. However, in relation to evaluation, counting is not enough because the complexity of the context in which interventions take place. Qualitative methods must be included to build full understandings. We are now going to split up into 3 breakout groups to discuss some questions. What are your experiences or expectations in what constitutes evidence in community development? What are the gaps in our knowledge? And finally, how can we work together to fill those gaps?
We started with the people's experiences. So the points that came out there were about not sure what other people were doing, and we don't share with each other what we're doing, and we don't have time, or our community groups don't necessarily have the time. If they're on the ground doing stuff, they don't have time to be able to collate evidence. It was noted that there's more training needed to support groups in moving that forward. We then spoke about things like GDPR and photographic evidence can make it difficult to know what you can use and what you can't use. It was also noted that it's imperative that evaluation starts at the very beginning of the project, from when people put in their applications, to start collating information. And the point was made about universities and colleges offer courses on writing evaluations, and communities can take advantage of that support. We had a lot more, but I will leave it at that one, and we can add to it maybe.
Thank you for that. Thank you very much indeed. Some very important points there about training and capacity. And of course, GDPR has set new challenges. Thank you for that, Nia and Gwyneth and the group. Can I hand over to Barbara and Sarah now, please?
It'll have to be Sarah, because I can't do anything in 2 minutes.
Well, I'll probably end up doing it in half a second, but here we go. mixed experience about ABCD and experience across all sections, but issues that came up were support for a qualitative and quantitative approach, and the experiences were mixed on that. Another issue that came up was short-termism and long-termism of projects, and the consequent end product can be very mixed when short-term funding runs out and there isn't the support for the ongoing work that's usually been very, very successful and much wanted. There's also an issue about clarifying what your assets were and the effort to inquire within the community where they saw their well-being being at the beginning. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
There are gaps in our knowledge. That the mapping exercise at the beginning is critical, but also that evaluation starts at the beginning or is thought about from the beginning. And the commitment to that evaluation from the beginning is probably what will secure the project going on for longer, because the evidence will emerge throughout the process. If it's only just done at the end as an add-on, it's less weighty.
Yeah, some important points added to the previous groups. Okay, Alison and Amy, please.
Hi. So I'm happy to discuss what we spoke about. So in terms of the first question about what constitutes evidence, our group highlighted the complexity of gathering evidence and the importance of the user voice and their stories and the different ways of using their voice. And we touched on perhaps how we could learn from the commercial world and perhaps picking on some different longer and shorter feedback loops on what communities are thinking and feeling. And then we also discussed some of the challenges, such as the pressure from funders, the constant promise to try and reach more people and impact more people. In terms of gaps, we discussed how communities with high social capital often have their voices heard. So there are gaps in determining how we can get those more deprived communities have their voices heard, and how we can hear from those communities and strengthen their voice. And in order to better work together to address those gaps, we were talking about trusting the communities in knowing that they know what's best for them, and devolving the money and the power and the decision making down to those communities to give them that power.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Amy. That's really some very good points that you've added there. You, Anna Maria, I'm marching on because I'm conscious that you're ready for your 5-minute comfort break. You, Anna Maria?
Okay.
Hi, you, Anne?
Maria's got feedback.
Right, Maria?
Okay, so we made the point that we're often trying to prove what we know to outside bodies. Also talked about what constitutes recognised evidence, because there's often confusion about which bodies want what. So we also talked about whether co-designing services and interventions is starting to happen more often, but it doesn't really happen very much in terms of deciding what sort of evidence should be produced. And so not many people had experience of that. Then we had, with the gaps in the knowledge, there was frustration that each project seems to be asked to produce evidence. So wouldn't it be better if there were regional organisations or national organisations that could do that for them? This made the point that this happens in medicine. So why are people trying to prove the case every single time when they could be just getting on with their projects making a difference to their communities? And then finally, with the gaps, evidence is not often shared with universities. Universities, for example, will have sort of areas that they like working in, but there's not very much cross-sharing between the universities and the areas. So if that impediment could be removed, it really could open the door to making that evidence accessible to a lot of other people.
Okay, thank you for that, Maria and Joanne. Just to say that in the field that we're talking about today, there are quite strong links between Cardiff, Bangor and Swansea universities, but maybe you know, some formal networks would help us. Nick, who's here, Nick Andrews, has actually convened a network for small community groups, and that network is going to be grown. That's right, it's small at the moment, and he's indicating to me that it's small, but it's going to be grown. Thank you for that. There's some really good points. Nick and Abby?
Okay,
Abby?
yeah.
Where are you?
Yeah, our three
Yeah.
main points were
Yeah.
we discussed what is the purpose of the evaluation and research, who is it benefiting, who is it helping, making sure it's not a tick boxing activity, is it to do with funding, thinking more long term, and the differences in how different organisations evaluate. And then we talked about the time it takes to evaluate. So we had some examples of it being merged into people's roles, something, you know, they're busy doing other important things, it can be hard to fit in, and that it should be everybody's business, it should be important to everybody the whole way through. And then we discussed everybody's worry of who we're missing, engaging in general, but especially around research and evaluation. Not everybody fancies taking part, but how do we encourage people to come forward in different ways? We talked about case studies, storytelling, using positive examples for people to reflect. And then finally, we just discussed, like you all did, about sharing conversations with each other, things like this today, and especially around data sharing. Even if we can perhaps look at certain parts that can be shared with each other, that would be useful.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm now not going to repeat all that because I'm going to, we're slightly behind time. I think that has been excellent, and we're going to encapsulate those points and actually hopefully use those points as well in order to push the evaluation agenda with on community development. Thank you to you all. That's a really rich and useful discussion. Can I ask now that we break into our comfort break for 5 minutes, and if you could come back so that we launch straight into our 4 presentations. Thank you very much for that, everybody, and see you in 5 minutes.
Good morning, and thank you, Sue. Reflecting on this morning, I think the case to test and develop approaches to research and evaluation that are appropriate, provide useful and legible evidence, and are cost-effective views across all these sectors has never been clearer. So I'm really happy to be presenting today. I'll share my screen and bring some slides up. Here we are. So, qualitative impact protocol and causal map, an exploration of the determinants of well-being in an asset-based approach. This project is exploratory. We are piloting a qualitative research method in Pembrokeshire, and in doing so, it will ascertain the utility of an approach informed by qualitative impact protocol, QIP, and the use of the causal map application. In this work, we also aim to evidence some of the mechanisms that either support or hinder place-based communities to thrive. We have looked at a number of approaches during the development stages of the research methodology, and I'll therefore start with a brief outline of QIP and the causal map application. QIP, it's a qualitative research method. It was developed by Bath Social Development Research Limited as a method to assess impact and gather evidence on causal influences in complex situations. Key elements of QIP which have informed our work include its focus on participants' own perspectives and views and its method of inductive coding. QIP coding focuses on identifying causal chains, cause and effect, influence factors, which are causes, and consequence factors, effects. Because it shares an emphasis on eliciting respondents' own accounts, QIP methodology has parallels with most significant change, but is distinctive in that QIP relies on more formal thematic analysis of causal stories rather than a collaborative process of prioritizing the most significant. Causal Map. It is an application designed to analyse complex causal mechanisms. All formal coding of the qualitative data takes place in Causal Map, and the data in this project being the transcripts of semi-structured interviews. The application creates graphical structures, a causal map to visually express the data without reducing any of the nuances in the narrative itself. Its ability to provide analysis of often complex factors and outcomes to display patterns and trends, whilst retaining what people say, is particularly useful. We will be using a semi-structured interview schedule questionnaire with individual respondents. The schedule will explore neighbourhood and locality, activities, institutions, with well-being as a cross-cutting theme. 3 key aims are addressed within these headings. Firstly, to explore the role of statutory resources, built assets such as central meeting place, healthcare, social care, and their effect upon well-being. Secondly, to explore elements that are citizen-led, non-statutory, are born of interest or personal choice in activities. Thirdly, and most crucially, it's the relationship between the two. Case selection. As can be seen on the slide, the population frame for source selection is 67 community council and 10 town council areas in Pembrokeshire. The stratification for this case selection is 1 community council and 1 town council, and the interview sample is 24 interviews in each of the council areas. Our definition of a case is the geographic area within the boundary of the town or community council and its population within all communities. Participants will be recruited through snowball sampling. We will identify a gatekeeper through our existing networks to support this work to ensure anonymity and adherence to GDPR. In our case selection work, we have stratified the 77 town and community councils against categories of assets in keeping with an asset-based community development approach. Some case selection and the asset map. This slide shows a snapshot of the asset mapping work, in this case, the work for town councils. The contents of the table have been simplified for the purposes of this presentation. Down the left-hand side are listed the town councils. Included in the lateral columns are the categories of assets: community-driven, clubs, community groups, associations, institutions, with a further division of healthcare and social care and support, and then place-based assets that includes public services, amenities such as post offices and libraries, transport links, central meeting places such as halls and places of worship, and shops. We have used all known resources in order to populate this table. As a pilot, we will sample 2 contrasting cases, 1 town council and 1 community council. The selection will be purposive and based upon high concentrations of assets relative to population. This approach offers the broadest context and scope for this project. Our rationale for this approach is based upon 2 considerations. 1, that causal processes will be different according to the quantity and quality of assets in any community or place. 2, the context, for example, whether an area is urban or rural, or densely or sparsely populated, will also have an impact. Our method is exploratory and in development, and we are discussing further how it can be used and improved with partners. The challenges of this work have highlighted to us the need for clear knowledge about what already exists and in ways that are legible. Both the diversity and disparity of assets have been really interesting considerations, and some useful questions have been raised about the role of work of this type. I'll now stop sharing and to conclude say a few words about where we are up to now. Clearly, COVID is setting challenges in changing the way we work. We'd hope to be able to do face-to-face interviews, but in order to press ahead and deliver on this work, we're doing phone interviews. We're currently piloting the SSI schedule of questions with participants in the community of Solva, and the schedule is being sent to partners for review and comment. We are also at the point to sample the 2 case study areas after which the interview process will be rolled out. As a final note, I'd like to say a huge thank you to my colleague Amy Gill, who's done some fantastic work on this with me. Members of the PAVS and Planner teams have also been instrumental in supporting this work with their detailed knowledge and insight. So I want to say a real thank you to you also, much appreciated. And thank you.
Move on very quickly to our next method-y type presentation from Jill. Jill has undertaken to take a stage further the Pembrokeshire Most Significant Change project. We're very grateful to her. She's working under the auspices of DEEP, and Nick is here from DEEP as well. So Jill, could I hand over to you now?
Yeah. So thank you for this opportunity to talk today. Sue's just given a lovely introduction, so I won't repeat that, but just to mention that Developing Enriched Practice Programme, or DEEP, is funded by Welsh Government through Health and Care Research Wales, and our remit is really to support people in social care practice, policy and research to engage with diverse types of evidence. What I'm presenting on today is we were asked to undertake a secondary analysis of most significant change stories which had been collected in Pembrokeshire. And in this short presentation, I hope to cover what the analysis I've done is based upon, its rationale, and the current work in progress, and also just highlight some of the next steps for the project. So I wasn't involved in the Meetings That Matter project, but I know that a number of people here today were. And the Meetings That Matter project was the starting point for the current analysis. This project collected stories of change relating to wellbeing prevention work across Pembrokeshire and Monmouthshire. And the project collected stories using the most significant change approach. I think most people here know more about most significant change than I do, but just in case there's one or two where this is a new term, most significant change is an approach where story collectors invite people to share their stories, providing a suitable opening prompt. And the prompt in the Meetings That Matter project was, please tell us a story of a positive or negative change you have experienced over the past 6 months of working with others to support prevention and well-being. The stories are recorded or are written down, and a few details are taken just to help place the story and the storyteller in their context. Once the stories have been collected, there are a number of ways most significant change stories can be analysed and the information collected evaluated. The most common is hierarchical group analysis. This is where a group of people come together, discuss the stories and select their most significant story, giving a rationale, their reasons for their decisions. You can also undertake a thematic analysis of their stories themselves, either letting themes emerge from the stories or looking for pre-identified areas of interest. In hierarchical group analysis, if you record the discussions that take place when people are selecting their most significant stories, you can also undertake a thematic analysis of these discussions. And then finally, in discourse analysis, you can look at the language, the terms and the linguistic structures used in the stories. I've highlighted in yellow the two forms of analysis used in the Meetings That Matter project. This gave a really good balance of learning from all the stories, yet still being able to present the stories that were felt to be the most significant. So given that the Meetings That Matter project did such a good job, why do we want to build on it with a secondary data analysis? Well, the project group in Pembrokeshire had a slightly different question they wanted to explore in the stories they'd already collected, and this was a story about how volunteering can contribute to people's well-being. So to answer that question, a new analysis was needed. Additionally, all forms of analysis have strengths and weaknesses. Hierarchical group analysis can overlook information provided in the non-selected stories. Analysing panel discussions will pick up some of that information, but in a second-hand way. If you like to think about it this way, the information from the non-selected stories is being filtered through the perspectives of the panel members in their discussions. So there is an argument, especially for planning activities, to draw on the information contained in all the stories. There's also a practical reason for considering whether thematic analysis of the stories themselves could contribute to planning activities. Hierarchical group analysis, although excellent, especially for staff development and service development activities, is quite time and resource intensive. And the thematic analysis of the stories themselves might be a more feasible way to build an evidence base over time using most significant change stories, especially as the framework we've developed as part of its secondary data analysis can be used in future analysis work. So there's now hopefully a starting place for future analysis. So the analysis question we had was, what changes or impact occurs from working with others to support prevention and well-being objectives? And the aims were to explore who told and who collected the stories, the similarities between the different types of analysis in terms of the themes identified. And just to recap, when I talk about the different types of analysis, I'm talking about the thematic analysis of the stories, and the analysis from the Meetings That Matter project, which was the thematic analysis of the panel discussions and their hierarchical group analysis. And then the final aim was to explore the reported impacts of volunteering on well-being and how this contributed to well-being and prevention initiatives. We used a type of analysis called framework analysis, which is a form of thematic analysis which involves 5 steps. In familiarization, you read the story several times, becoming immersed in them. And through this immersion, you start to see what themes, what ideas are emerging in the stories. And through that, identify a thematic framework. We also had a pre-identified thematic framework in this analysis because the project group knew that they wanted to explore ideas relating to well-being, prevention, and volunteering. In indexing, you highlight relevant sections of the stories relating to the framework. And in charting, you extract these sections of the stories and arrange them into data charts so you can start to compare what different respondents have said about the different aspects of the thematic framework, looking for similarities and differences. Mapping and interpretation is when you bring the analysis together, and that's the stage of the project I'm involved in at the moment, and I'll come on to in a moment the next steps in terms of that work. So we had 16 stories available for analysis, so all the findings should be considered preliminary only. Of the 16 stories, 7 had been included in the Meetings That Matter project, and 8 stories were additional. Some collected much more recently, but the story collection procedure was the same in all cases. The storytellers were 9 people with support needs and 7 who were caring for family members in all cases. And the storytellers spanned the adult age range. Most story collectors were people who were working in the 3rd sector. Now, because this analysis is ongoing, I'm only sharing a few highlights of the thematic analysis so far rather than the full findings. But we did find information relevant to all the pre-identified themes around prevention, wellbeing and volunteering. And there was also an emergent theme of virtuous spirals or virtuous cycles, where positive changes were seen to snowball over time. On this slide, I've just pulled out some of the sub-themes that seem to relate or contribute to people feeling that their well-being improved following contact with wellbeing and prevention services. And I'm sure if you scan down the list, none of these things will be surprising to anyone present here. And for those people in the meeting involved in the Meetings That Matter project, again, many of these themes, these sub-themes will be very familiar to you and you'll recognise them from your own analysis. And this duplication is actually a positive finding because it just suggests that a thematic analysis of the stories, which might be more feasible on an ongoing basis, can identify similar themes to more resource and time-intensive panel discussions. From the very tentative analysis it was possible to make, it also seemed that volunteering can give many of these factors as well. So volunteering might be an alternative route for some to achieving enhanced well-being. So in terms of next steps, as I said, we're at the mapping and interpretation stage of the analysis at the moment. And the next thing on my list to do is to meet with the project steering group to present the findings of the analysis and kind of sense check the themes with them, see what they make sense from their lived and professional practice experience. This is important to help enhance the validity of the analysis, and that meeting will also hopefully give us an opportunity to explore how the analysis and its findings can inform future story collection and analysis work in Pembrokeshire. I'll of course share a report with the project team of the secondary data analysis, its methods and findings that can be used in the future. And I also just wanted to mention, although not directly related to my work, but I know the project team looking at this area in Pembrokeshire has just purchased a new piece of software which will help them to collate and hopefully also analyse most significant change stories in the future. And this dovetails rather nicely with its secondary data analysis, where one of the key outputs is having a draft coding framework that they can continue to build on and develop over time as they analyse stories into the future. I know there's not time for questions now, but I will put my email address in the chat box in a moment. And if anyone does have any comments, observations or questions, please just get in touch.
Thank you very much, Jill. Thank you very much indeed. And yes, unfortunately, we haven't got time for questions, but do use the chat box and link up with Jill, who will be pleased to talk with you. Welcome, Sue Leonard, who's just joined us. Great that you could come for the second part of our meeting. Well, look, I think MSC is a really important method. It really captures what people are feeling and thinking. Gwyneth has just put a comment in the chat box that the community connectors are collecting stories for service development, and Russell has also found the method to be used in other parts of Wales. So the reach of Swansea University and the DEEP project is going obviously far and wide. So without further ado, I'm going to now hand over to Russell, who's going to talk about, I think, a really interesting report that he's been involved in with Wizard, Cardiff University. It's called Weathering the Storms, the Hidden Value of Community Anchor Organisations. I had never heard of the term anchor organisation before, except, well, in relation to services I had, but not in relation to communities. So, Russell, if I could hand over to you. Yeah, Russell, are you there?
Yeah, thanks, Sue.
Okay.
Good morning, everyone. My contact details are there. I'll drop them in the chat as well, and people are welcome to get in touch about anything that I'm about to raise and talk through. It was a piece of work that emanated out of, next. There we go. A much bigger research program called Productive Margins, Regulating for Engagement. It was ESRC funded, that Wizard was heavily involved in with Bristol University as well. The first sort of storm in inverted commas that was considering was the phasing out of the community's first program, which ran from 2002-ish to 2018. And I'm indebted to co-researchers on this, Eva Elliott, honorary researcher and doctor from Cardiff University and Wizard, and also Alan Herbert. Anyone who's been in community development in Wales for a long, long time will probably have crossed paths with Alan. At some point, he was, literally doing community development when I was in short trousers. Worked for a disability organisation up in Pontlan Ffraeth in the Sahawi Valley in Gwent at the moment, but most people will have crossed Alan's path in relation to South Riverside Community Development Centre in Cardiff, which was one of the community organisations that was part of the Productive Margins work, and obviously to the support of Wizard. Very quickly, we spent a few months with sort of leaders, staff, trustees from 9 community anchor organisations across Wales. My background is largely, not exclusively, but largely on the Community's First programme, which certainly in its sort of second or third trimester, if you want to break it into sort of 3 trimesters, which is one of the analyses of that programme, from about 2012 to 2018. It became a much more urban-based programme. Rural areas left it. And so we very much wanted to strive. It was great for me to kind of get out of that more urban valleys footprint in terms of and finding organisations doing community development, and certainly asset-based community development. So we had a mix of rural, some ex-communities first organisations, and by that I mean who were based in communities first areas, but also some that had some employment role or maybe programme delivery role within the programme as well, and so had the experience and the background of trying to evidence the impact that they were having in that programme in a very, I think the consensus is a very sort of top-down performance management framework that was heavily reliant in its latter phase on the methodology of results-based accountability. And anyone was around at the time involved with Communities First who worked on that, apologies for bringing it up again. We also had, by way of a sort of a bit of a mixed methodology, we had some focus groups that were held as part of Adult Learners Week in 2019, and we were going to have a range of workshops actually into 2020, but however, as you all know, another storm, again using the sort of nautical theme, another storm brewed in the shape of the pandemic, and so we moved some stuff online, which clearly was not as immersive as we would have liked, but we did the best that we could. And in terms of co-production, this was intended to be a co-produced form of research, and to be honest, it probably didn't achieve what we wanted to in that respect because of just things that were outside of our control, really. So that's an interesting experience that we can sort of use in the future. Having said all of that and try to look in forever the silver linings to these dark clouds, I think the timing has possibly worked out quite well. Sue mentioned it in her introduction around, I think we used the term sort of community spirit, Sue, being quite strong or stronger than it's been for a while. I think certainly there's been a renewed focus on communities off the back of the pandemic. We've already had one or two interesting conversations with Welsh Government to that effect. But clearly with the election happening and everything else that will follow that, I don't think necessarily some of that's going to be public for a while. I'm not going to dwell on this at all, but only really in the sense that, and again, it echoes the point that Sue made around not being familiar with the term. A lot of the more basically urban politics agenda, urban theory agenda, and literature, there's reference to anchors. They can be found within some of this literature, but they tend to be grouped under sort of fairly overarching. I think Nick used the term nebulous in the chat. This kind of fairly sort of bland, generic sort of names, just kind of catch-alls. Third force organisations, neighbourhood regeneration organisations. Certainly, where you can identify, as Stephen Thake does, a mature operational culture and extensive body of experience, and I'm specifically drawing that out with respect to experience, and I'll return to that in a moment. Nevertheless, it does still tend to be very urban focused. And it still has quite a broad range of actors. And again, I've only left this specific bit in simply because I was made aware that there was going to be lots of people from lots of different backgrounds, organisations, sectors, and the like. And I think though we may all strive to achieve the same things and want the best for communities and in communities, I think most of us would recognise that there's quite a distinction between, how health centres operate, community councils operate, anchor organisations, much more grassroots, unconstituted, less formalised community groups as well. And things like social prescribing, for example, are beginning to tease some of those out in a very kind of practical way at the moment. So these terms that we used in the literature still tend to be very, very broad, and personally, I don't think necessarily all that helpful. And Stephen Thake still recognises a messy and incoherent picture, which I think is interesting because the term anchors, specifically for Sue's benefit, but everyone else as well, you can find it in the 2004 New Labour document, Firm Foundations. But again, it still has this very abstracted concept of community, a term that Raymond Williams, in his Keywords book from the mid-70s, calls community a warmly persuasive word. Unlike all other terms of organisation, of social organisation, such as state, nation, society, it never seems to be used unfavourably. And I think we need to get past some of that, as Stephen Yo does, where he refers to community, or a better understanding of community, as this interrelated, contested, interrelated contested relations, and what he calls the full of awkward elbows, which I love. And I'll leave you to decide which of you are the awkward elbows. In terms of the anchors that we spent time with, these are some of the findings. Again, it's a big piece of work. I've tried to distill as much as I possibly can for your benefit. This term community, they serve communities of place by and large that are locally meaningful, but not necessarily coterminous or recognised by formal administrative boundaries. I'm stating the obvious, I suppose, but each of them had examples where organisations from largely the public realm were wanting in some way, shape or form to manipulate and impose certain boundaries that suited them and not necessarily the anchors and the communities that they recognise. I drop in the reference to Raymond Williams and his sort of warmly persuasive description of how the term community is used. These community organisations are very, very defensive. They're very, very focused on these communities. They're very engaged with these communities. They are very much geared towards the assets based in them. But they don't have a complete and total blind spot to communities. They know what some of the issues are. They know where some of the pressure points emerge. They know some of the less maybe savoury things going on in communities. But it's that local embeddedness that makes them alert to that. So this isn't community is wonderful bed of roses by any means at all. Buildings and how they operate and manage those buildings are important symbols of identity, but they are incredibly energy sapping and expensive. But they are spaces that communities can identify with, that communities can feel safe in, that communities come together. One of the organisations that we were with, their sort of hub, their HQ, has got a more kind of colloquial description of the community's living room, which I think is lovely. A lot of the public bodies that are here today and others that work with communities, they don't have living rooms. They don't have community living rooms. And so the buildings are really, really important. And it's where that you can actually get the rich stories that people might have for you to share. So where you want to find your stories, where you want to mobilize and most significant change methodology, for example, is something that's really, really worth considering. Clearly, they're independent of the state. They're run by and accountable to the community to varying degrees and to varying success as well. And these things they wax and wane over years. One of the things that I think they don't do enough of themselves and isn't necessarily recognized enough by others is that by having that accountability, by having that sense of community ownership, it takes a long time to establish it, and it takes an awful lot of work in some cases to maintain it and retain it. It isn't some switch that you switch on, you flick on, and suddenly you have community accountability, you have community ownership. It has to be worked for, and it takes time. You have then this interesting kind of dichotomy. Again, we talk in community development about working both for and against the state. Often they're partners with agents and levers of the state and tiers of the state, but they also try as much as possible, but it's as easier said than done, to challenge the state and to try to hold the state accountable on behalf of the communities that they are working with and on behalf of. And that's not necessarily a comfortable position to be in. Their values-led and mission shapes pretty much everything they do, from their strategy, how they generate income, governance, board development, volunteering, the volunteerism, all of those sorts of things, building operation as well. They're values-led. They do it because they want to and because they're motivated to do it, not because they have some sort of statutory responsibility to dispense what they do. This thing around expertise and knowledge, again, it comes back to the point that Stephen Thake was making. They hold contextual knowledge, and contextual knowledge was something that came up in my little group with you and a couple of the others. And this expertise that is derived from that knowledge is nurtured over a long, long time. And it informs and underpins the ABCD that they do. What is interesting is that not all of them necessarily articulate ABCD as a core practice with any overt sort of statements or expression. It actually comes through in more in less overt sort of terms. The language that they use less than the things that they say, if that makes sense. They often have a narrow or single focus initially, maybe community education. So, for example, South Riverside Community Development Corporation, they had a very early focus on things to do with rent control and access to housing in inner city areas, that kind of early sort of 70s urban renewal. They had some squatter movements that related to it. And now, of course, if anyone knows SRCDC, they're involved in a massive, massive range of services and projects from advice, community cohesion, local events, and so on. Those origin stories do tend to get a little bit lost. They don't tend to get articulated. And I think that's something that anchors, we are, through this course of this work, are throwing back to anchors, that maybe they could harness and mobilize those origin stories for a little bit greater effect. And what is absolutely key here as well is they're central to a web of relationships. both internally between local people as individuals, between local groups, but also externally. And these things go from kind of left to right, top to bottom. They span hierarchies, they cross sectors, and all of the messiness again comes back to that messy sort of incoherence, the awkward elbows that less idealistic interpretation and conception of community has. But one of the things that was very clear, both from the early productive margins work and was reinforced, certainly as the pandemic part of the latter phase of this work, when the pandemic was dominating things, was that if you threaten the organisations, or if they're put it another way, if the organisations are under threat in any way, the web of relationships also can be affected. But clearly, the local context will dictate the extent to which that is the case, and how bad and how negative the impact potentially can be. You can see that these things they're not necessarily easy things to measure: our independence, our values, our mission. And this is where I think there is this sort of, again, ongoing fundamental kind of tension between what they are, who they are, what they do, and the more maybe established mainstream forms of measurement and evaluation of things. Mixed experiences working with the public sector. So, that's just the reality. That's what they said. What was interesting was there was a consensus, not across all of them, that where social prescribing is an activity, that there were some really productive relationships emerging. Some of them had some really positive things to say. Community education historically too, as well, has been a topic or an area that there's been some really good productive relationships. Despite key individual relationships, and this was something that they all said, they have good relationships with key officers in public bodies. Overall, local authorities, primarily but not exclusively in the public sector, still fail to understand what anchors do, what they are, who they are, what their values are. And there does need to be some ongoing work to keep refreshing that, because individuals move on. What's interesting is that the staff and the trustees and the people involved with anchors, there's a much slower turnover, much less of a turnover. They can be around for a long, long time with these organisations because they're committed to them. And so they're forever having to refresh and renew the relationships because of the turnover that tends to be on the other side, as it were. Then this is a very key thing just in terms of the co-production debate. The tendency still to persist anchors as subservient. The moment they get a grant off a public body, or the moment that they are commissioned to deliver something, that there's this sense that they are now a client, that they are subservient to the body that is essentially the other side of that contractual arrangements. And that's something that does really, really need to be equalised and kind of flattened out, or whatever the term is. A real enduring frustration is this sense of what we call a cuckoo effect, the potential for their ideas to be colonised. It's an occupational hazard of working. That was an actual quote from people of working with the public sector. I think one of the things that is potentially interesting, and we just kind of throw this up there, if a genuinely effective relationship, a co-productive relationship is established, does that sense of that cuckoo effect, is that potentially mitigated? And it would be interesting to see if that is the case. Any power that anchors retain, and this is a key thing, because again, how do you measure power? Any power that anchors retain is due to their independence, it is due to their distinctiveness from key practices, values of others. There is a tendency, however, on the part of some to overly define themselves by what they aren't and who they are not. And that I don't think necessarily is always helpful of those organisations. And again, I think they could, by re-engaging with some of those origin stories of theirs, could actually re-engage perhaps with some of that core initial purpose and drive that established these organisations, and define themselves a little bit by what they are rather than whom they are not. And this is also related, I think, to a weak collective identity among anchors in Wales. Most of them didn't know the others that we were interviewing. They might have heard of them, but they had no idea who the staff were, no idea who the trustees were, no idea what they were getting involved in, what sort of methodologies they were using, how they were evidencing, what funding they were getting involved in, and all of that sort of stuff. That seems to be a real shame, given the potential sort of rich sort of learning and sense of, if nothing else, sense of solidarity that they could establish. Diverse funding requirements was something that came out. Now that stating that anchors have diverse and numerous funding requirements will not be new to anyone here. But there's a mix of demands of those funders, or from those funders, that can, on occasions, for some of them, challenge some of their core mission and core values. And by basically having to play that game, that to accept the king's shilling, that they're always having to question, are we selling out? Are we compromising ourselves? and the organisations involved in the commissioning and the funding of these sorts of, whatever they are, services, programmes, projects, initiatives, whatever, need to be much more cognizant that it is not money that is sort of free money, that is inevitably wonderful and lovely, and they should be grateful. There is often this debate going on internally as to what do we have to give of ourselves, what do we have to give up, what do we have to sacrifice in order to take that money. And it was a recurring theme that came through.
Russell, sorry to interrupt you in full flow. Could we allow people to look at your final slides online, because we're a little bit pressed for time? Okay. So could I ask you to just in a minute sum up, please? Apologies, but we're very short of time now.
The basic, a couple of the things that we suggested was, we needed a clearer community policy in Welsh Government. Nothing has really evolved since communities first ended. There's some interesting stuff in the Building Communities Trust Manifesto. For anyone who hasn't heard of Community Movement Cymru, that's a very nascent network, I'm not going to call it an organisation, that's around developing a collective capacity, which again might help in terms of that weak identity. And one of the things that came out was very much that universities and maybe kind of like the teaching aspect of health boards will have some relationships with these sorts of organisations and the communities that they work in and represent and are involved with, but they tend to be a little bit, in inverted commas, sort of pet relationships and pet partnerships, rather than anything that can kind of cascade out or be learned from. And there's, you look at something like the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, and a lot of what that is setting out is stuff that anchor organisations, it comes very, very core to what they do and what they have been doing for a long time.
Thank you very much indeed, Russell. A really important report for understanding these, as you call them, anchor organisations, locally rooted organisations. You say that more research is coming. Well, I think that report in itself is going to be very useful for understanding them. It's a fabulous start. Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to move swiftly on because we're now running quite a bit behind in time. And I'd like to hand over to Sue Chiklovska from the Research and Innovation Hub, who's going to be talking about a local evaluation of projects funded by the West Wales Care Partnership called Programme 7. So Sue, could I hand over to you, please?
My name's Sue. I'm from the Research, Innovation and Improvement Coordination Hub. There's 7 of these hubs across Wales, and we are here to help really cover all the questions that were addressed in the workshop earlier about how we share and disseminate research, innovation, improvement, evaluation and audit across all the sectors. We're here to really make sense of the cluttered landscape out there. So just moving on quickly to the presentation, we were asked to do an evaluation of a community networking programme, which were the Community Connector Plus programme of part of the Transformation Fund Welsh Government funding that is part of the Programme 7, Creating Connections for All. So what we were asked to do by Public Health Wales through Rebecca Evans, who was part of the implementation of the Programme 7 group, was to look at community connectors, networkers, link workers, social prescribers across the 3 counties of West Wales, which is Ceredigion, Pembrokeshire and Carmarthenshire. And it was really interesting because the link workers or connectors were based within those 3 different sectors in the 3 different counties. So when we were asked to look at what was happening with community connectors, and community connectors are those people that have a social need rather than a medical need, and the community connectors help facilitate a co-produced response to that need to create their own autonomy. So it may be an older person coming in with low mood that goes through general medical services and is then referred to a social prescriber or community connector to be connected with a local community group. Now, that's a bit of a beef in its own right, because there is a front door to general medical services, but there is not an apparent front door into general social services. So what we needed to do was have a look at the community connector model or the social prescriber model and see how it was impacting the general landscape in West Wales. So first of all, we had to look at, were we going to do research and evaluation and audit, and how are we going to access any of the data that we could collect. So just as an aside, I've put in this slide to say, really, these are the 3 questions you need to ask yourself. We wanted to look at the effectiveness and efficiency of the community connector model in the 3 counties delivered from the basis of the 3 sectors. And we looked at the tools we could use. A lot of metrics were collected, and these were separate to what we wanted to understand. We could have used surveys, questionnaires, but we opted for interviews because this would give us a more detailed qualitative view of the landscape. So what were we evaluating and why? Could we really measure change or measure impact, measure outcome and output? Well, outputs are quite easy to measure, but measuring the others are quite more difficult. So we really needed to look at how we would engage with the landscape, looking at the bigger picture and understanding impact. We also really wanted to understand what hindered or helped engagement across the 3 counties from the 3 different sectors. So we chose the qualitative method. We used a thematic analysis. We interviewed 26 people, but they were all people related to the service. We did not interview beneficiaries of the service. So I'm quickly going to move on, because when we looked at change, we had to think, well, hang on, that change is different depending on the basis in which the community connector is embedded. So within social services, for example, increased access to services at a national level means it's interpreted as better care. Whereas actually when you're looking at a local level, you want to decrease services because you want to create independency, not dependency. And actually it was a reduced connection with services that made the difference. And the same when you've got services that are linked to health. We assume that if people don't access primary care services, then that they don't have a health need. But that is a big assumption that we make without actually having the evidence base for it. Within the voluntary sector, it's a bit harder. How do we assess that change? Are we looking at increased connection with services? Does that create dependency? Does it create autonomy or independence? So how do we actually measure these changes? So what we really wanted to understand was what was happening, and I don't think we really found out anything new, but what's important is we're writing it down so that we have an evidence base in order to understand what is going on and so that people can refer to it. So the role of the community connectors across the 3 counties was absolutely overwhelmingly recognised as valuable and effective from a qualitative point of view. The metrics will also give us an indication of ascribing any other benefits. So what we found out was the placement of the link worker was really important. When they were in the voluntary sector, there was less governance around the roles. So the link workers were much more agile and responsive. So in terms of learning, that was something that we can take on board, that the less ties we put on the role, the more effective they can be. From a local authority perspective, and we found that the community connectors were more pulled towards their social work colleagues, and the demands on their role were widened and broadened. And from a primary healthcare perspective, the social prescribers were expected to really buy into that medical model of care and were more put upon in terms of providing mental health support. So again, it was looking at what exactly is the role of the link worker, and the recommendation is that we define that role, look at more of the core competencies of the role, and build up a more structured analysis of the role. Funding, well, for all the reasons we found that the short-term funding is has its own complications. But what we did find, and the recommendation of the limitations of short-term funding and the pressures that social prescribing and connecting put on voluntary organisations, was they were expected to expand with the increased referrals, but without any financial resources in order to do that. So the learning from it is maybe to look at commissioning and procurement and look at easier ways of driving funding into services that statutory sector organisations are referring into. So we then, the bigger questions around catalysts for care, do they increase the need for care, do they avoid care or delay care, into the wider service picture? And again, this is something that we need to look at and expand upon. We also need to look at the type of evidence we collect when we're looking at qualitative evidence, case studies, MSc, when we're looking at all the ways we collate the evidence. We often, in the voluntary sector, we have a skewed positive motivational narrative because we want to sell what we do and we want to justify our funding. So the other thing was looking at how we engage with the wider picture. And from this perspective, it's looking at, hang on, how do we actually link in with things at grassroots level? How do we market our projects? How do we assess that it is a grassroots need? Do we do any assessment of whether our project has viability within the community space? We looked at the training needs, and yes, we needed to consolidate those and make sure there were a core set of skills and competencies. But one of the biggest things was the fact that community connectors were fantastic at cross-disciplinary working. They did straddle those lines between local authority, health, and third sector, and they were brilliant at doing that, and that is a big learning tool. So the last slide is really looking at what do we do with these results, what and who are they useful for, who do we share them with, what do we share them, is there reasons to share some of it and not all of it? Research is quite cut and dried. We share stuff very readily through journals, they're all peer reviewed, but with evaluation, improvement, innovation, we don't readily share that information because it's often personal to the service. And do we share the things we need to take learning from, which is often the most useful point, but could be construed negatively. So it's when do we share it and how do we share the information? And I always think if we share information in the place where we initially look for the information, we're probably starting off on a really good footing. So thank you, everybody. I'll stop there because I know we're really limited for time, and that was the quickest presentation I've ever done in my life.
And it was another fabulous presentation. Thank you, Sue. Lots of points there for debate and discussion. Unfortunately, we haven't got time today. It's great to see some locally funded or regionally funded work evaluated in that way. And it was a great shout out for the connectors, of course, who we know are working so hard across the region. Thank you for that, Sue. And I hope that you're willing for people to contact you. When can we see the report? I know that is still waiting for clearance, is it?
Yeah, we will share the full report as soon as it's signed off, which should be within the next week. Rebecca's online and she should be able to tell us when, but we will make it available. It's a very positive report and a lot of learning from it.
Yeah, very interesting report. And as you say, it'll be very useful for all the sectors, right across the sectors. Well, look, I'm determined to wind up as close to 11:45 as possible, and actually we're a minute past that according to my watch. It's been a really good meeting, very crowded. It's meant that we've not been able to interact on the presentations, so it's a bit of a learning curve for us, that. But you know, you're very welcome to look at our website, look at the reports and presentations following this meeting. I'd like to wind up quickly, because I know some of you are going to other meetings, by thanking on your behalf our chairs, our scribes, and to our presenters for the four great presentations. True to form, in a minute we're going to put a little evaluation form up that you need to click on to see what you thought of this and whether you think it's a good idea to have other events. But before we do that, I'd like to thank you all for coming and to highlight the date of our next event to you, which is on the 20th of May, and it will be a spotlight on the arts. Now that will be a combination of R&D, research and development, so it will be, you know, looking at different forms of the arts. Amanda Stone, who's here actually, is going to give a presentation on the Wellbeing Writing Workshop that she's running currently, that's been very successful in Solva. And of course we have other organisations and agencies joining that, and we will make sure that evaluation and research runs throughout that event. Thank you very much, everybody. And I was going to say have a good journey, but of course you're staying in your homes or going to wherever you can go to next in relation to your work. So here's the evaluation form. What's your opinion of today's forum event? And would you like us to organise more meetings on the theme of community development and on the theme of research and evaluation? Actually, I have found today invaluable. Okay.
Yeah, almost there with the poll.
And a final word, we will also be running a session on the 10-point plan of Pembrokeshire and the region, because there's a lot of interest in that, and we want to make sure that other people input both within the county and region and from outside into it. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for all your contributions, and hope to see you soon. Bye.
Bye.